So today, we're talking about the architects of English prose. And I mean that literally. These are the people who didn't just write in English. They actually built the language we use for everything from history to science to just telling a good story. Let's dive in. I want you to just think about that for a second. Imagine all the history, all the philosophy, the religious texts that shape your entire world, but they're all locked away in a language you don't speak a single word of. For the average person in Anglo-Saxon England, this wasn't some hypothetical question. This was just reality.
And this was the fundamental divide. You had two completely different worlds. On one side, you've got Latin, the language of power, of the church, of all the important scholarship. And on the other side, you have Old English, the language people actually spoke in their homes, in the fields, the language of everyday life. The challenge was bridging that gap, and that challenge is what kicked off a full-blown literary revolution.
So, here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start in that world where knowledge was totally locked down in Latin. Then we'll meet the very first historian who laid the foundation stone. After that, we'll see a king's totally radical project to unlock it all. Then we'll check out the master craftsman who built on that vision, and finally, celebrate the birth of English prose itself.
Okay, let's start with part 1, a world locked in Latin.
And that brings us to part 2, the first English historian. Meet the Venerable Bede. You gotta understand, this guy was a giant, a monk, a truly brilliant scholar. People often call him the father of English history. He was one of the greatest minds in Europe, a man driven to understand and document everything about the world he lived in.
And the stuff he wrote was absolutely monumental. His ecclesiastical history is basically the reason we know so much about early England. It created the nation's origin story. And this is the crucial part, he wrote it all in Latin. So it was a history of the English people, but it wasn't for the English people. It was for an international, scholarly audience who could read the language of the elite.
All right, now for part 3, the king's radical project. Because this is where a true visionary steps onto the scene with a master plan to change everything. King Alfred the Great. Now, most people know him for fighting off Viking invasions, right? But you could argue his most lasting victory was actually his war on ignorance. He had this core belief that a strong kingdom needed smart, educated people. And Alfred didn't just tell other people to write. No, he got his own hands dirty. He personally translated major works of philosophy and religion from Latin into Old English. And, maybe most importantly, he kicked off the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year history of his own people, written in their own language for the very first time.
And this gets to the heart of his whole project, the vernacular, the language of the ordinary people. Alfred's idea, which was, completely radical at the time, was that wisdom and knowledge shouldn't just belong to the clergy. It needed to be available to everyone, in the language they actually used every single day. This was a revolutionary act. He was basically democratizing knowledge.
This was his strategy. It wasn't an accident. It was a clear 3-step plan to rebuild English culture after decades of war. First, revive learning. Second, translate all the most important books. And third, use those books to educate the people. It was a way to create a shared identity, a shared purpose.
So, part 4, Prose for the People. Alfred laid down the blueprint, and now it's time for the master craftsman to get to work building the rest of the structure. First up, we've got Ælfric of Eynsham. You can think of him as the great educator of his time. He was a monk, a brilliant theologian, and he saw Old English as this incredibly powerful tool for teaching. His whole goal was clarity. He wanted to make things easy to understand. So he wrote these huge collections of sermons and stories about saints' lives, all designed so a local priest could just read them aloud to the congregation. He was making complex Christian ideas accessible and compelling for literally everyone, not just the scholars. And then you have Wulfstan. Now, if Ælfric was the patient teacher, Wulfstan was the fiery preacher. He was a bishop who used English prose not just to teach, but to warn, to persuade, to grab people by the shoulders and make them listen, especially during a time of national crisis.
This quote pretty much captures the whole vibe of his most famous work, the Sermo Lupi et Anglos, which means the Sermon of the Wolf to the English. See, the Vikings were invading again, and Wulfstan gets up and argues that the real enemy wasn't just the Vikings. It was the moral rot inside their own society. He used this powerful, urgent, repetitive language to call everyone back to God.
So you can really see the difference here. Aelfric and Wulfstan together show just how powerful and flexible English prose was becoming. You have Aelfric using it to patiently educate, and then you have Wulfstan using it to passionately sound the alarm. The language was growing up. It was becoming a tool for all sorts of different jobs.
And all of this brings us to our final section, the birth of English prose. With the foundation laid and the structure built, something new and lasting had been created.
And you know how you can tell it was a success? The whole tradition became bigger than any single person. Suddenly, you have all this important work being produced by anonymous writers. That's the real proof that writing prose wasn't some specialized craft for a few geniuses anymore. It was a widespread skill. And just look at what they were creating. The Old English Hexateuch, that's a translation of the first 6 books of the Bible. I mean, can you imagine the confidence you have to have in your language to think it's worthy of carrying the most sacred texts? It's incredible. And works like the Blickling Homilies and the Vercelli book just prove that there was this rich, vibrant literary culture all happening in the vernacular.
Now, one quick thing to keep in mind here. While they had this amazing poetry and prose, the idea of drama, plays performed on a stage, that didn't really exist yet. That art form would come along much later, eventually growing out of religious rituals that happened inside the church.
So, what's the big takeaway? What's their legacy? Well, these writers basically embedded certain themes deep into the DNA of English literature, themes we're still wrestling with today. Ideas about heroism and courage, about faith and salvation, the sadness of loss, and the importance of history and leadership. They really set the agenda for centuries of writers to come.
In the end, these architects took the everyday language of the people and built it into something powerful, a vessel that could carry history, faith, law, and identity. They used the tools they had to literally forge a culture. Which leaves us with one final thought. They built a language to shape their world,